This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Rebecca Larson, and well, look, it's my brother from another mother. Matt Lewis is here.
I'm back again. I can't believe you keep letting me in. This is so cool.
I think you
have to do something really wrong this time. I need to get you to swear so badly that this podcast gets taken off air.
Oh my gosh. I was just going to joke that I gave you the key. That's how you keep getting back in, but now I think I need to change the locks.
Oh, it's too late now. It's too late. I'm in.
He's like hiding in the closet. Okay, now it just got weird and creepy, didn't it?
Yeah. You know those weird guys that live in your walls? That's not me.
That's not you.
That's not me.
We're off to a good start, aren't we?
Well, it fits with the topic we're going to talk about today, or at least half of the topic we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Creepy guys.
Creepy guys, yeah. And last episode, we did the episode on the idiotic sons of Henry II, and we didn't have time to finish with John. And then we also wanted to talk about the daughters of Henry II as well, because they're quite fascinating. I don't know if you were going to bring in the other daughters of Eleanor, but we'll kind of see how this plays out today. But I definitely, after last week talking about these sons who seem to, I'm just going to say it, have their heads up their asses half the time. But the daughters, they have to be the saving grace of the family.
They are. I mean, they're brilliant. They are faultless. They are the perfect princesses. They do everything that their brothers are utterly incapable of doing. And so I thought, before we get to John and we continue the horribleness that was the sons of Henry and Eleanor, and we get to arguably the worst one of all, I think we need this like palate cleanser of the daughters, who are actually a really, really good bunch.
Yeah. So, okay, how many daughters did they? Because I know Eleanor had like 2 daughters by Louis, and did they just have 3 daughters together, Henry and Eleanor?
Yeah, that's right, 3 together. So Marie and Alice are the 2 that Eleanor has with Louis VII. So they stay with Louis. And as far as we know, once their marriage is annulled, Eleanor never gets to see them again for the rest of her life. So they get married off to allies of Louis. They become countesses in France and live, as happy lives as I imagine they could. And then, yes, there's 3 daughters that Henry has with Eleanor amongst those kind of 4 surviving troublesome sons, because there are some children who don't survive as well, particularly William, the oldest.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So what makes these women interesting? I mean, I feel like right off the bat, you just make it sound like, first of all, they're way more intelligent. They have a better grasp on politics. Do you have a favorite of the 3?
Joan is probably the most fascinating, I think. In dynastic terms, arguably Eleanor is the most important, but Matilda is also very impressive, and she gives us a really nice insight into the family life. So I think all 3 of them have a really good story to tell, and most of the story that they tell is one of hard work, devotion to what they're supposed to be doing, and kind of, like I said, they're everything their brothers aren't. They succeed at everything their brothers fail at. So the oldest of the daughters of Henry and Eleanor is Matilda, who is born in 1156. So she is the 3rd child, the 2nd surviving child, because the oldest boy, William, dies. So we have, she's the 3rd child and the 2nd to survive, and the oldest daughter, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
And she lives until 1189, the same year as her father dies. There's quite a lot of family drama that goes on in that year. So she only lives into her early 30s. But during that time, she is married at the age of 12, as was, not unusual during this period, in 1168 to a man named Henry the Lion, who is Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, which is a pretty cool name as well, Henry the Lion.
Yeah, it is.
He is, though, 27 years older than her.
Oh.
He's like a 39-year-old man marrying a 12-year-old girl, which to our sensibilities is awful. But this is dynastic politics in the 12th century. It's just a reality of the world in which they live. So we know that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I is really interested in an alliance with Henry. And this is a mark of how high Henry's star has risen, that the Holy Roman Emperor is reaching out for him, looking for an alliance. And the plan was a marriage for the oldest two of Henry's daughters, Matilda and Eleanor. And one would be married to Frederick, who is the son of Frederick. So Frederick called his son Frederick because that's annoying.
Yeah, how original.
And also another marriage to Henry the Lion, who is a cousin of Frederick's. So only one of those marriages goes ahead, and that's Matilda to Henry the Lion. They seem to have a reasonably successful marriage. We know they have several children, and amongst those children is Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. So one of Henry II's grandchildren becomes Holy Roman Emperor. And I think this is, throughout this episode, I think we'll see, we often talk about Queen Victoria being like the grandmother of Europe. Yeah. And I think you very much get that with Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine as well. You see their grandchildren, spreading out throughout the royal houses of all of Europe, and the amount of influence that brings the Plantagenet family and the connections that they have. So they have a daughter, Matilda, named after a mom, presumably, who becomes Countess of Perche. They have a son called Henry, who is a Count Palatine, and a son called William, who becomes a lord. And although they seem to have a fairly successful marriage, Henry the Lion has problems with Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor. He doesn't get on particularly well with him. And we know, for example, in 1181, this reaches the point where Henry is sent into exile from the Holy Roman Empire. And Frederick offers Matilda and her children a castle to live in and an income if they want to stay in the Holy Roman Empire. And, he will protect them and make sure they're looked after. And perhaps we can think about this as a signal of the nature of their marriage, but Matilda elects to go into exile with her husband and take her children with them. So only one of their children stays behind in the Holy Roman Empire, and the rest of them travel, and they end up traveling to England. So they go to the court of Matilda's father, Henry II, and we get this. They're there for 3 years in the end before Henry the Lion is reconciled to Frederick. And during those 3 years, we get they're constantly at court. They're around, and you get this idea of Henry and Eleanor as the doting grandparents. Absolutely loving having this daughter back. Who Eleanor knows more painfully than most that you may well never see your daughters again once they go away to get married. You send a 12-year-old off into the Holy Roman Empire, you might expect never to see her again. She's got 2 daughters in France who she's never going to see again. Her other daughters are also married young and sent away to far distant lands. And you can't help wondering whether this is just such a nice moment for Eleanor in particular, but also for Henry, to have a daughter come back to them and to see the family that they've built, people that they might not otherwise have met and ever come into contact with, to get to spend 3 years with their daughter and their son-in-law and their grandchildren. I can't help wondering whether that felt like a real gift for them, something unexpected that they actually get to enjoy in the early 1180s. So after the boys have been behaving badly in the early 1170s, here is the tonic of a daughter turning up going, look at the great work I'm doing. Isn't this fantastic? And, They end up going back. They're reconciled. They go back to the Holy Roman Empire. As I mentioned, their son Otto becomes Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. And so Matilda seems to have done everything right, but Otto will end up losing the crown as Holy Roman Empire. He's kind of kicked off the throne because of John. It's John's fault.
Here we go.
So there's always a boy to come along and ruin it, isn't it? This woman's done incredible work. There's always a boy who's going to come along and absolutely burn everything that she's done brilliantly.
And of course it was John.
Of course it was John, because he's the youngest, he's the baby, and he likes to behave like a baby, and he's the biggest idiot. So then, 1189, Matilda eventually passes away, but is leaving quite a legacy and has been, in dynastic terms, very, very successful. The match has worked out very well. The second daughter, who I mentioned earlier, who was part of those marriage arrangements with the Holy Roman Empire, but her marriage didn't go ahead, is Eleanor, presumably named for her mother. She's born in October 1162, and she is the couple's 6th child, so the 5th surviving child and their second daughter. She will live until 1214, so just before Magna Carta. She doesn't quite get to see the biggest mess that John makes of everything. But she lives to be, 53. And she is married to Alfonso VIII, who is King of Castile. So she becomes Queen of Castile and Toledo, to give her full title. And she's sent off and married at the age of 8. So even, this is quite young for this period. But it's also, that's a similar age to her grandmother, Empress Matilda, getting sent off to the Holy Roman Empire. So again, not entirely unheard of. And Alfonso and Eleanor have, a long enough and successful enough marriage that they have 12 children.
I think that's pretty successful.
I think by any measure, that's a working relationship. Only 8 of those children actually survive to adulthood. And Eleanor becomes incredibly impressive and successful because she ends up having to act as regent for their son, for Henry I. Henry, that name again, probably named for his granddad. When Alfonso passes away, Henry is still young, and so Eleanor acts as regent in Castile. Everybody is perfectly comfortable with her effectively ruling Castile on behalf of her son. And so there's a grandson of Henry and Eleanor who is now going to be King of Castile. And perhaps her best known daughter is Blanche, and she marries Louis VIII of France. And so she is the mother of Louis IX of France, the Saint King. Blanche acts as regent in France for Louis, both when he's young between 1226 and 1234, and also when Louis goes off on crusade from 1248 to 1252. She acts as regent again then. Sorry, no, I've got those dates wrong. Why am I got? Because that's after she's... Sorry, I've made a mistake with some dates.
No, you're
there.
Fine.
Well,
I didn't know you made
No, sorry, I haven't. No, because I was talking about Eleanor and thinking about when Eleanor died, and I'm talking about Blanche now. Sorry.
Okay,
that was all right. Sorry. Apologies. So Blanche acts as regent twice for her son Louis. So between 1226 and 1234, when he's still a minor, she is regent of France. And again, when he goes off on crusade from 1248 to 1252, Blanche acts as regent of France again. So here we have another a granddaughter of Henry and Eleanor who is doing an incredibly impressive job. She gives them a great grandson who is a saint. Who doesn't love that? Louis the Ninth becomes a saint.
Wow. Yeah, she wins the award.
Yeah, I feel like if you ever got all of Henry and Eleanor's children together in a room and you asked them to pick their favourite, I don't think they're even looking at a boy.
They're like, you guys move over to the side.
Yeah, get out your sister's way and let us just decide which one of them's the best.
Yes, exactly.
And then the youngest daughter is Joan. So she's born in 1165. She's the last but one child, so the only one that's older than John. And again, she lives until 1199, so dies at the age of about 33, 34. And in that short life, she packs in so much. She's another one who was sent off to be married at the age of 12. So same as her oldest sister. And she's married to William II, the King of Sicily. So she's headed off into the Mediterranean for some lovely weather.
Yeah, nice change.
Yeah. And Sicily at this point is an incredible place. So the kings of Sicily are essentially Normans who have gone there from Normandy and conquered Sicily and set themselves up as kings there. So this is another Norman conquest that's happened in Sicily. And it's a real melting pot. They have pretty good relations with the Muslims of North Africa. There isn't this kind of tension that we often think about there must have been between all Christians and Muslims in this period. They get on incredibly well with Muslim populations that are around them. They accept influences from them. A lot of the architecture in Sicily is heavily influenced by Muslim architecture from North Africa and things like that. It's an important trade route into Italy. So a really buzzing, really vibrant place. And, if Eleanor of Aquitaine loved being in Aquitaine because it's this light, airy place where the culture is enough to make you feel alive, then Joan is getting a dose of that in Sicily too. And, you'd like to think she enjoyed her time there. But we also know her happiness might have been fairly short-lived. William dies in 1189, so the same year as Henry II dies. Mentioned, big year for the family.
Yeah.
Joan is widowed at the age of, what is she, mid-20s, 24. And this ends up causing Joan a really significant problem. So when William dies, the throne of Sicily is seized by his illegitimate cousin Tancred. So we've now got King Tancred on Sicily.
Great name.
And Joan, yeah, it's an unusual name, but it's a great one, a good Norman name. And Joan is trying to back the cause of William's daughter, so her stepdaughter, William's daughter from his first marriage, who is called Constance, and she's married to Henry VI in Germany. So she's too far away is the problem. Tancred is on the ground and snatches the crown. But Joan is desperately trying to keep the cause of Constance alive, to kind of keep William's direct bloodline on the throne of Sicily. But she's kind of alone on Sicily trying to do this. And Tancred is obviously not very happy with all of that. So he arrests her, puts her in, under house arrest in Palermo, and seizes all of her lands and money. And she stays there until Richard arrives. So Richard arrives on Sicily as part of his journey to the Third Crusade. And we mentioned before in the Richard episode, he ends up getting married to Berengaria of Navarre there, ends up kind of getting into this big fight with Tancred. And essentially Richard is saying, you've got my sister prisoner and I'm not standing for that. And there is an element you can see Richard acting genuinely in that he is now the patriarch of this immense family. The Angevin Empire is his. He's the head of that family, and his sister is being held prisoner by someone who doesn't really have a right to the throne that he's sitting on. So you can expect, I think, Richard to behave in the way that he does. But the bad form side of what he does is that once he gets Joan released, he pinches all of her money and puts it into his crusade pot and says, Joan, just come with me. Just hang out with me. You don't need your money. You've been looked after by the king now. Who needs money? And so Joan kind of has a lot of her agency taken away from her by her brother at that point. They eventually leave Sicily. So this causes a fair delay in the efforts to get to the Holy Land. But when they leave Sicily, Richard sails off, and he now has Berengaria with him, his wife. He has Joan with him, and he puts them in a separate boat to his. And as they're sailing across towards the Holy Land, there is this almighty storm that separates the ships. Richard is stranded on Crete. He washes up on kind of Crete. But Joan and Berengaria find themselves almost on the shore of Cyprus and slightly stuck and alone on a ship. Not alone, there's a crew there, but they've been separated from the rest of the fleet, is what I meant. They're not single-handedly rowing the ship. Yeah. And there is a man ruling Cyprus who is named Isaac Komnenos, so he's part of the Byzantine, he's connected to the Byzantine emperors. And he rules under the splendid title of the Despot of Cyprus. I mean, he's not even pretending he's not a despot. So, wow. And he tries to lure them on shore, and they appear probably quite rightly to believe that this is a trap, that he's going to kidnap them. I mean, which makes Isaac pretty stupid, because if you've seen what he's just done on Sicily, he's gone to war with the king of Sicily to free his sister. You're kind of inviting one of the most impressive military men of the age to attack you as well.
Yeah.
So Richard turns up. Joan and Berengaria are running out of supplies, but they're doing their best not to have to go ashore. But Richard arrives, while they're still off the shore, and they must say to him, Isaac's been trying to tempt us on board, but on shore, but we assumed he's going to try and kidnap us. And Richard's like, well, I'm not having that. So of course he invades Cyprus. Why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
What else are you going to do? And
I picture them saying, this guy's over there on the shore trying to tempt us with fruits and other candies.
Yeah, it's like, come over to the dark side. We have chocolate. We have cookies. And Richard, for reasons that only Richard can possibly know, is like, that's it. I'm not having this. I'm conquering Cyprus now. And you can imagine everyone else who's trying to get to the Holy Land being like, oh, Richard, come on. We've done Sicily. Can't we just head off to, the thing we're actually supposed to be doing? Do we have to conquer all these places on the way? But it's also a mark of just how impressive it is that this is a man who can just sail up to an island and go, that's it, I'm conquering this place. I'm having it. And, Isaac Comnenus does his best to fight Richard off, but simply can't do it. He's overwhelmed. And Richard takes control of Cyprus, and eventually he will hand this over to the Knights Hospitaller, and it'll become part of what happens after the Crusades in the Holy Land, the way that he deals with Cyprus. But we also know that he takes into his custody Isaac Comnenus's daughter. So one of the striking things about her is we don't know who her mother is. She's believed to be an Armenian princess, but we don't have a name for Isaac's wife. We don't have a name for the mother. And despite the fact that this girl is now documented and is part of the story of Richard the Lionheart and the Crusade and becomes part of Joan's story as well, she's put in the care of Berengaria and Joan. We don't even know what her name is.
Oh, that's odd.
She just doesn't have a name anywhere in any source. She's just Isaac's daughter, which sums up the attitude of lots of chroniclers to women, I guess.
Yeah.
And she will end up being traipsed around in the household of Joan for quite some time. And her story is another sad and not a very pleasant one. She never goes back to Cyprus. As far as we know, she never gets married and she doesn't get the chance to be happy. All because her dad, annoyed Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah.
But they eventually sail on from Cyprus. They get to the Holy Land. Joan is present at the siege of Acre, which is, Richard arrives there when the siege has been going on for ages. I think we talked about it last time, and just walks in and goes, right, I'm just going to end this siege then, and successfully walks into the city. So she's witnessing lots of this stuff that's going on in the Holy Land. She's moving around with Richard's army in his sort of entourage. So he's experiencing all of the problems, the illness that she's witnessing in the Holy Land and all of that kind of thing, the uncertainty about what's going on. At one point, Richard makes an offer. So he's in contact with Saladin's brother, and they seem to get on really, really well. And he's acting as a go-between between the two of them. And at one point, Richard says to Saladin, go and tell Saladin he can have my sister Joan in marriage. That'd be a good way to make peace between us, wouldn't it? And again, you get this image of Joan going, what now?
Yeah, she's like, wait a second.
Hang on, you've already got my money. You're not marrying me off. And we get this great scene that happens next where Joan goes absolutely mad at Richard. She's like, I am absolutely not marrying, a Muslim sultan. Absolutely not. And Richard's like, oh, go on, it'll be all right. We'll get loads out of it and everything else. And Joan's answer to this is to go to the church and say, this man is trying to make me marry a Muslim and stop me being a Christian. And the church immediately go to Richard and they're like, dude, you will be excommunicated if you make her do this. We are not having it. And again, I think you can imagine Joan standing behind all the churchmen going, ha ha, told you, told you.
I'm smarter than you, brother.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what the boys are very slow to realize. The girls know what they're doing far better than they do. And so this plan kind of falls through, and Richard tries to style it out, and it's like, hey, it's only a joke. I didn't mean it. And Joan ends up, she travels back. When Richard's ship is shipwrecked, she makes it back to Italy, and ends up traveling back and doesn't, she's not imprisoned when Richard is imprisoned. But she ends up getting married again to a man named Raymond VII, who is Count of Toulouse. Ownership of Toulouse has been this kind of contested thing. Eleanor of Aquitaine believes it's part of Aquitaine, so she ought to own it. The Counts of Toulouse are like, actually, I think you'll find it's ours and we're keeping it. So this, from a dynastic point of view, is really interesting, because now you've got an Angevin princess marrying the Count of Toulouse. The next Count of Toulouse is going to have Angevin blood. And so is this another smart way to heal one of those rifts in the family? They do have a son, so this guy becomes Raymond VII, the Count of Toulouse, because all the Counts of Toulouse have to be called Raymond. And they have a couple of other children too, but the story ends badly and sadly. In 1199, we get Joan turning up at Fontevraud Abbey, so where her mom is based, and she's pregnant with her last child, and she's complaining that she's being treated so badly by her husband Raymond that she simply can't live with him anymore. She's run away from her husband while she's pregnant, which is startling for a medieval woman to do. She asks to be admitted as a nun at Fontevraud. So pregnant married woman asking if she can be a nun at Fontevraud. And it's perhaps a sign of the influence of her mother and her family more widely that she is allowed, she's permitted, she's entered into Fontevraud Abbey. But part of the reason they may well have done this is because it appears that she was actually quite ill as well. She's at the end of her pregnancy and she's very unwell. It's we're not certain exactly what causes this illness, but she gives birth on the 24th of September 1199 and she dies during childbirth. And her son Richard only lives long enough to be baptized, and then he passes away too. So it's an incredibly sad end to what has been a pretty difficult life that might have started out in the light and the heat and the warmth of Sicily and that fantastic cultural situation that she'd have found herself in. And then she ends up dragged around the Holy Land by her brother, ends up in an unhappy marriage that she might well have made for dynastic reasons. But it's so bad that she ends up leaving it while she's pregnant and dying as a nun at Fontevraud Abbey in childbirth.
Wow. Her story of the three sisters, I feel like her story is, I don't want to say the most interesting, but it's like the most dramatic. And
it's an incredible story. There's a biography of her written by Kath Hanley called Lioness Heart. So, she's the female counterpart to Richard is how Kath kind of positions her. And Kath isn't a massive fan of Richard I, as it will become obvious if you read the book. But if you want to know more about Joan, I thoroughly recommend reading Lioness Heart. It's a brilliant, brilliant book.
Yeah, I feel like when you were talking about the part where they're offshore at Cyprus and Richard shows up and he's like, well, I might as well conquer this. It kind of gave me this impression of Richard being this territorial dog, so to speak. Like he's like, oh, I got to go rescue my sister from this other guy, and why not conquer that place? And now we're over here too, and I'm going to pee on the beach and claim this as my own too.
That's exactly. I was just thinking exactly the same thing. You're exactly right. He's wandering his way to the Holy Land, cocking his leg up everything he goes past. It's like, this is mine now. This is mine now. I'm having this as well.
Yeah. And I don't know whether or not I should be impressed by that or annoyed with it. I'm like, I don't know how to feel about him.
No, I mean, it's one of the tricky things with Richard. He's hard to like, but he is absolutely impressive in terms of a 12th century military king. You would struggle to find many better than Richard. But that necessarily makes him a really hard person to like. Yeah,
he is a hard person to like. But the sisters, you told me they were interesting. You told me they were fascinating. And I just want to know as much as I can about them now, because I think back to maybe when they're all home together and they're sitting at a table eating dinner, and you have the boys arguing and throwing food at each other and the girls quietly eating or maybe secretly reading a book under the table. That's how I picture it.
Yeah, I think it is that. It's exactly that. The boys are the jock idiots and the girls are the nerds who are actually going to get stuff done.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know, what kind of education did they have? I mean, I'm sure they were prepared to run a household and things like that, but it seems like they were far more prepared to do things like be a regent.
Yeah. I mean, they obviously leave home incredibly young. So Eleanor at 8 and the other two at 12. But up until that point, their entire life would have been centered around preparing them for the splendid dynastic marriage that their parents would have expected to make for them. So there would have been no doubt that their education would have prepared them to be good consorts, to provide the kind of support that a king would need, to give them the intelligence that they need, an understanding of how kingdoms are administered. And again, you could see it as a sign of the success of those educations that Eleanor ends up being regent for her son in Castile, and no one has a problem with that. Yeah. they are, incredibly successful. And I don't doubt for a second that Henry and Eleanor educated them to be the kind of regents that they knew a king would need. They want their daughters to be successful wives to the most powerful king that they can possibly marry them off to. And so they have to be good at what they do. And so they have to be given this education to equip them to perform that role.
Do you think in the end, the sisters were way more successful than the brothers?
I think so. I mean, if you look at, with the exception of John, the other sons don't leave a dynastic legacy. Henry the young king doesn't have any children. Geoffrey has Arthur and Constance, who have very sad stories and don't survive. Richard doesn't have any legitimate children. There's only John who ends up having Henry III and creating a dynasty that will continue afterwards. But when you look at what the daughters do, I mean, Joan doesn't have any children. So, well, no, Joan does have children from her second marriage. But you look particularly at what Eleanor is doing in Castile, and dynastically, I mean, if you run through her children, I'm going to have to look at the list of them because I'm not going to pretend I know this off the top of my head. But you get the oldest is Berengaria, who ends up married to a Duke of Swabia, and then she's married to Alfonso IX of Leon as his second wife. So again, she's becoming a queen, and she is Queen of Castile in her own right after the death of her brother Henry I. So she becomes Queen Berengaria of Castile, and then abdicates in favour of her own son, who becomes Ferdinand III of Castile. So dynastically, she's having an impact on the Iberian Peninsula. And then you've got Urraca, who marries Alfonso of Portugal. You've got Blanche, as we said, who marries Prince Louis, who later becomes Louis VIII of France. You've got Ferdinand, who is heir to the throne until he dies in 1211. And then you got further down, I can skip a couple. You've got Eleanor, who marries James I of Aragon. So again, you're marrying across the Iberian Peninsula, connecting Aragon and Castile and places like that. They're having incredible dynastic success. I think, you've got a Holy Roman Emperor from one daughter. You've got kings and queens of various parts of the Iberian Peninsula from the second daughter. And you've got a Count of Toulouse from the third daughter. That's not a bad return from the three daughters.
No. And I think this is part of the reason why Catherine of Aragon has English blood, why she could have been seen as an heir to the English throne as well.
Yeah, so you've got that English blood being worked in from that point, and then by the time you get to Catherine of Aragon, you can also add in the 14th century campaigns of John of Gaunt over there, who, he marries daughters into the Portuguese and Spanish royal families. So there is lots and lots of Lancastrian Plantagenet blood all across the Iberian Peninsula by then.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I always feel like every time I talk to you, I want to stop studying the Tudors and just move to medieval.
Do it. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to corrupt everything. There's too much Tudor in the world. Get rid of it all.
There is a lot of Tudor, and I always feel like, we talk about the Plantagenet reign being over 3 centuries. That's a lot of time to cover. How does a medieval historian even decide where to put their focus on? You can't, you clearly know everything about everything when it comes to the medieval period. Would you say your specialty is the later end when we get to Richard III?
Yeah, I think kind of Wars of the Roses is still what I would call my history home. That's where I'm most at home. That's where I will gladly waffle away for hours and hours and hours without taking a breath. And I still find it endlessly fascinating. I'm still learning things about the Wars of the Roses. I've been studying it for better part of 30 years now, and I still learn stuff all of the time about the Wars of the Roses. But I think part of it is also that it's part of doing God Medieval podcast. You must get it as well. You encounter guests who tell you something that's like, well, I want to know more about that. Yeah. And it sparks an interest in different parts of the history from what you're used to. And, I've gone back and written, so I wrote about the anarchy because it's another civil war. So what does that tell me about the Wars of the Roses? Is it the same? Is it different? What does my understanding of the Wars of the Roses bring to the story of the anarchy kind of thing. And then, you come across these figures like Henry and Eleanor. I wrote a book about them because I wrote the book about the anarchy, and it ends with Henry becoming king. And you're like, I feel like I've only just got started with this guy. He's up to so much by this point. I want to know what else he does.
Yeah.
And so you find that these moments kind of just grab your interest. And then you do find yourself kind of filling in the gaps in between. So there are, I don't know everything about the medieval period. There are bits that I'm less clear on, but I want to be able to stitch all of those stories together. And, I need to know what order all of the kings come in to understand kind of what's gone before and the challenges that they're facing and all of that kind of thing. So I think you just kind of develop a bit of an overview by doing that as well.
Yeah, I think it was the same for me with the Tudors too, is, you learn about Henry the Seventh and then you learn about Henry the Eighth and his children. And then you go, but what came before them and what caused them to make the decisions that they did? Because they would have known of the history before them as well. And yeah, that's where I get you going down these rabbit holes that maybe you didn't expect to go down. But yeah, it's fascinating. These women, I'm so glad that you shared these stories, and I don't want to switch to their terrible brother John, but
let's just leave him out of it. Can we talk about something else for the rest of the podcast? Let's just leave it there.
Poor John.
No, not poor John. You wait till you find out what an idiot he is.
I feel like, and I don't know a whole lot about him. I just feel like he just made a mess of things and bungled things up and, caused his own issues. I don't even know where to start with him because obviously he became, was he named heir under Richard, or was Richard already looking at Arthur at that time?
Yeah, I mean, Richard seemed, particularly when he's travelling towards the Holy Land, Richard seemed to be really keen to position Arthur as his heir. So his nephew, the posthumous son of his brother Geoffrey. How Richard planned to make that stick, we're not sure. And obviously he's married Berengaria, so the idea would be to have a son. So there's nothing set in stone about any of that. By the time he gets back, obviously while he's been away on crusade and while he's been in captivity, John has been behaving very, very badly. He's, got in cahoots with Philip II, the King of France, and started taking lots of Richard's land. He occasionally tries to pull I've just got the news that Richard's dead in the Holy Land. Does that make me king? And everyone's like, hang on, no one else has heard this, John. Where are you getting this news from? I don't think you've got a trustworthy news source there, sir. But he's up to all kinds of stuff. By the time that Richard gets back, he still doesn't have a son, and he seems to then start shifting his focus a little bit to John because Arthur is falling into the orbit of the King of France much more. Arthur is Duke of Brittany and is being raised at the French court much more. And Richard seems, he makes efforts to try and get Arthur to his court and to get control of him, and Philip resists this. And so I think you see Richard start thinking, I'm not sure I can let this, this protege of Philip become the next King of England, except that my only other option is John, who's just awful. And has been in cahoots with Philip and working with him against Richard at various points. So it's kind of the least bad option at this point appears to be John. And when Richard dies in 1199, it seems to be primarily Eleanor of Aquitaine who makes sure that John becomes king because of this idea that Arthur is outside of their family's control and is too close to Philip. And, if Eleanor ever made one mistake, this might be it. As much as I love her, she's fantastic. She did incredible things, but she's also responsible for giving us John. So he becomes King of England in May 1199, rules until his death on the 19th of October 1216, which is 17 years is an impressively long time for a man who is so awful at what he's doing. And perhaps speaks a little bit to the institution of the crown. But he behaves terribly when Richard comes back from his captivity and John has been behaving awfully. Richard forgives him almost straight away, but he forgives him very much with a patronizing pat on the head and like, oh, the baby's been naughty, but never mind. He treats him like a badly behaved toddler, and he speaks to him in that vein, and he's clearly putting John down and reminding John of his position. But he he makes sure that John is married to a wealthy heiress, Isabella, the Countess of Gloucester, probably the most valuable heiress in England at the time. So they're married when Richard becomes king in 1189. But one of the first things that John does when he becomes king is annul his marriage to his wife, because now he's a king. He thinks he can get a better one.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, what a guy. What a move, John. Thanks. And so he goes off and marries Isabella, another Isabella. Maybe you like the name, I don't know. Who is the Countess of Angoulême, who there's lots of discussion about the fact that he just fancied her a lot, enough to marry her. Lots of stories of him staying in bed with her when he should have been working, and people, having to go knock his door and remind him he's got a job to do. The issue with Isabella of Angoulême was that she was already betrothed in marriage to a member of the Lusignan family, who don't take this very kindly.
Oh, it's not a good start.
No. So, John is irritating people and upsetting people from day one. You can imagine this guy. The thing, do you like Robin Hood Men in Tights?
Yes.
Mel Brooks film. Yes. So, the John there that sits on the throne, it's good to be the king. That is John for me. It's like, I now have all of the power I've ever wanted, and I'm going to do really bad things with it.
Oh my God.
There's a guy whose first act is to ditch his wife because he thinks he can do better now.
Yeah.
That's a pretty bad start to a reign. John and Isabella of Angoulême end up having a reasonably successful, at least in dynastic terms, marriage. Their oldest son is the future Henry III. Then they have a second son, Richard, who becomes King of the Romans. So he's the only Englishman ever to be elected effectively Holy Roman Emperor, but he doesn't actually get the Holy Roman bit because he's not crowned by the Pope. So he's King of the Romans, King of Germany, the only Englishman ever elected to that post. They have Joan, who becomes Queen of Scotland. They have Isabella, who does marry a Holy Roman Emperor, so becomes a Holy Roman Empress. And their youngest becomes Countess of Pembroke and marries into the Marshall family. So, might not be a queen, but she's marrying the Marshall family. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, they're dynastically, they don't do a bad job, really. John also has lots of mistresses and illegitimate children as well, because of course he does, because it's John. We wouldn't expect anything less, would we?
Because he could, right? He's like, I can.
Yeah, because he can do what he likes. It's good to be the king. And John's story is interesting. So during his father's reign, we talked about him a little bit. He was destined to be the Lord of Ireland. So there was this plan to make him sort of King of Ireland or Lord of Ireland. He goes over to Ireland at one point and behaves so incredibly badly that the whole of Ireland hates John immediately. There's one story in a chronicle that he is essentially teasing all of the Irish lords and taking the mickey out of them. And then he starts grabbing fistfuls of their beards and yanking their beards out.
What?
I mean, how to win friends and influence people, John. You forgot to read that book before you went.
It's so dumb.
So he's already, yeah. So it's just petulant, stupid, childish, exactly as Richard has been treating him. So he's behaved incredibly badly in his dad's reign. He's behaved incredibly badly in Richard's reign. We probably shouldn't have imagined he was going to be any better in his own reign. But his early reign is actually a story of reasonable success. So by 1202, he wins the Battle of Mirabeau, where his mom Eleanor has been besieged by Arthur. Arthur is making a bid for the crown that he thinks is rightfully his, backed by Philip. He lays siege to Mirabeau Castle with his grandmother Eleanor of Aquitaine in there, and in one of his rare moments of success, John turns up, like a lightning bolt, and defeats Arthur's army, captures Arthur, and then probably kills him, because it can't all be a good story because it's John.
Yeah.
So he's often blamed for the death of his own nephew, Arthur. But by 1204, and I don't think it's any coincidence that 1204 is the year that Eleanor of Aquitaine dies and the wheels start to come off everything. So a month before she dies, John loses Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, so it's protecting the east flank of Normandy, and is in very quick succession driven out of the whole of Normandy. So within months of the death of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Angevin Empire is beginning to fall apart, and it's very clear that John is not the man to bring all of this together. So he's faced with this continental issue. He's beginning to lose lands. Philip II of France becomes known as Philip Augustus because he's this great conquering figure. He has started that process against Richard, and I think if Richard had lived longer, Philip might have really struggled to keep what he'd taken. He's possibly fortunate that he ends up next facing John, who is not very good at all of this stuff and makes Philip look really, really good. And because trouble abroad isn't enough for John, he has to have a bit of trouble at home as well. And all of this kicks off in 1205. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named Hubert Walter, who had done an incredible job as Archbishop of Canterbury, he dies. John tries to keep the see vacant for as long as he possibly can, because while there's no Archbishop of Canterbury, all of the revenue goes to the crown. And guess who gets that? John.
Yeah.
And he's thinking, it's good to be the king. It's even better to be a rich king. That would be fantastic.
Everything is going my way.
Exactly. Everything's coming up, John. But the monks at Canterbury aren't keen on this. So they elect their sub-prior, Reginald, to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. John thunders down there to Canterbury and is like, absolutely not. Yeah, I'm not having this. You need to set that election aside. Yes, you have the right to full and free elections, but you have to elect the man I say. That's what full and free means in John's England.
Yeah.
So he says, fine, we'll have an Archbishop of Canterbury. We're not having your man. You're going to elect my man, John de Grey, who is currently the Bishop of Norwich. And the monks of Canterbury are like, no, we're not. I'm not going to do it. And their previous experience of stuff like this was the Thomas Becket affair. So they're perfectly well aware of the mire that they're getting themselves into arguing with the king about this. And the other dimension to this is the Pope at the time is a man named Innocent III. Innocent is quite young when he becomes Pope, and he is utterly driven by the belief that the papacy is the vehicle to unite Europe, particularly in a crusading effort. But he believes that the church in Rome should have control over the secular world. So all of the kings and princes of Europe ought to be subservient to the Pope. And he's determined to enforce that. So when he sees all of this going on, his answer is to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury himself from Rome. So he picks a cardinal, an English cardinal who is in Rome at the time, a man named Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton is an incredibly intelligent bloke, very gifted, not John's choice, and therefore John is not going to accept him as Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's appointed in 1207. John utterly refuses to recognise this appointment, to the point that the following year, 1208, England is placed under an interdict by the Pope. So this is essentially the removal of all church services. Bishops, priests, monks are no longer delivering services in church. They are no longer baptizing children. All they are required to do is care for the dead, and a couple of other very important feasts throughout the year, maybe. And I think it's hard to overstate just how devastating to a medieval population this would be. The church bells have gone silent. No one is now interceding on your behalf to God. If you die, your soul is now in peril because of what John is doing. And John does not care.
Wow.
Because as the following year, so 1209, the year after this, Stephen Langton, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, at least as far as the Pope is concerned, excommunicates John. And he orders all of the bishops of England to leave, and all but one do. So the only one that stays is a man named Peter de Roche, the Bishop of Winchester, who is one of the last great fighting bishops of the medieval world. He's a really fascinating figure. There was a rhyme about his name, because Peter de Roche kind of means Peter of the Rocks, and people used to call him Peter de Roche, who's hard as rocks. He's the only one that stays behind. So all of these bishops are gone, which is kind of like having vacant bishoprics and vacant sees all across the country. And what happens to the money from all of those vacant sees? Oh, it goes to John. So the people of England are caught in this spiritual turmoil. All of the bishops of England have left, and John is sitting there rubbing his hands together. He is absolutely raking in the money all throughout this period, and that seems to be the only thing that he's bothered about. He is bringing in every year at least 4 times the maximum that Henry II managed to bring in a year. He is getting incredibly rich from doing this.
I just have to say, I knew nothing about this. This is all new information. This is unbelievable to me. Was John not religious at all? Did he not have a conscience?
I don't think he did. He can't have, really, can he? You know, the people of England, I think, were probably tearing their hair out thinking, how do we fix this problem? And John is going, 1 penny, 2 penny, 3 penny. Oh no, I've lost count at 47 million pennies. Let me go back and start again and count all my money again. And we get lots of chronicles that talk about John having, because the only currency in medieval England is a silver penny. So there's not gold coins, there's not notes or anything like that. There isn't kind of paper money in existence. So all of the money that John is getting is silver pennies. And several of the chroniclers talk about John having rooms in castles up and down the length of England, absolutely stuffed with barrels full of silver pennies. There is just money. It's Scrooge McDuck diving into, vats full of money. This is John swimming around in his silver pennies. This guy is loaded. He's got more money than he knows what to do with. He probably doesn't have a clue how rich he is at this point, but he is incredibly wealthy. And all he has to do is endanger the soul of every single subject in his kingdom. And he doesn't care. It's during this period as well that he falls out with one of his barons, a man named William de Brieux, who he'd been quite close to. He'd been a reasonably good friend of John's, as much as anyone can be a friend of John, which sounds like a euphemism for something, doesn't it? I don't know what friend of John might be a euphemism for, but it's not going to be good, whatever it is.
It's not.
No one wants to be a friend of John. But he falls out with William de Brieux. Officially, it's over some debts. There's also a rumour that William's wife accuses John of killing his nephew Arthur, which is never a great idea.
No.
Saying it out loud is not fun. So William de Brieux flees to Ireland, where William Marshal is at this point. So John is so bad that even William Marshal, who was willing to serve just about any king in the universe, goes off to Ireland because he can't serve John, because John's awful. William de Brieux goes over to Ireland, and John chases him to Ireland, and he tries to turn on William the Marshal. And we get, at one point, William Marshal says, I will accept a challenge to trial by combat from any knight that you name. And John kind of looks around going, go on, and who's going to fight William Marshal? And everyone takes 3 steps backwards. And he literally can't find anyone willing to fight William Marshal. So he has to let him off, because he can't find him guilty in trial by combat because no one will fight him. But William de Brieux kind of heads back to Wales. John chases him back there as well. And William ends up fleeing onto the continent and France, but John catches his wife, Maud, and William's oldest son, William, and he imprisons them. And we're not quite sure whether this is at Windsor Castle or at Corfe Castle in Devon, but at one of those 2 places they are imprisoned, and John gives the order that they're to be locked in a room and left there. Nobody goes in to feed them. Nobody goes in to give them any water, until John says to the guards, eventually, after a passage of weeks, go and check on them. I mean, what are you checking on? It's pretty obvious what's going to have happened, isn't it?
Wow, yeah.
They open the cell door, and the sight that greets them is more gory than anything they can possibly have imagined. So they find Maud cradling her son, William. I mean, he's in his late teens at this point, so he's not a small child.
Sure.
But she is dead against the wall, sitting against the wall, cradling William in her arms. And he's also dead. And the guards can tell that Maud has had to watch William die in her lap. And they can tell this because it's clear that she got so desperate and she got so hungry that she's bitten a chunk out of her son's cheek.
Ugh.
She's tried to survive by eating part of her son's flesh. She's been driven to that by the hunger. And this is the reality of what John does to people.
This is what makes him so terrible. It is. He's there. You can talk about John. He gets accused by his barons of sleeping with their wives and their daughters and all sorts of things. There are things that do that sound like, he's a bit of a lad and, he's a bit naughty. He's also someone who starves a mother and her son to death. Yeah.
Because their husband, slightly upset him, or maybe she said something he didn't like. That's the measure of the man for me. It's a horrible, horrible episode in his reign. But meanwhile, he's getting rich, and he's working on, part of his grand plan is if I can get rich enough, then I can go back to war with Philip in France and I can try and get some of those lands back that I've gained. By 1212, Pope Innocent III, kind of more formally excommunicates John. So the Archbishop of Canterbury has done it, but now you're in a situation where the Pope is coming along and saying, I'm not going to write a big letter saying that you're excommunicated unless you sort all of this out. And that technically means that John is ripe for being deposed. It's the same that happens to Elizabeth I in the Tudor era, this idea that she can be removed from the throne by force. John is in that position in 1212. But he's also rich and he doesn't really care.
And everybody
hates him. By 1213. Sorry?
And everybody hates him.
Well, yeah, I mean, who's not going to hate this guy by now? I'm all for revisionist history. I big into Richard III and don't believe he deserved the reputation that he got. I think you can make arguments about Richard not being as terrible, Richard I not being as terrible as people quite often think he is. But I draw the line at John. So
yeah. There's no redeeming qualities.
No, I mean, he's quite good at getting money, but he gets it in pretty terrible ways. So the year after the Pope excommunicates him, we get to 1213, and Philip Augustus in France is planning to invade England. I mean, he's got papal go-ahead to invade England and depose John. And John's response to this is actually kind of a masterstroke, but also one of the most stupid things he does. And I think it's just a measure of how desperate he is and how weak his position is by this point. Because in May 1213, John meets with a papal legate named Pandulf and hands the Kingdom of England over to the Pope.
What?
He makes himself a vassal of the Pope. So this is something, again, that nobody really talks about in the medieval world, because this is not undone. So the statement that John reads out and signs, puts his seal on, effectively says that he's giving the crown of England to the Pope. He will be a vassal of the Pope, and this will bind all of his successors. So Henry III is considered a vassal of the Pope, and the papacy tries to tax England to the hilt. And this is something that is never expressly undone, really, until Henry VIII's break with Rome.
Wow.
So for the entire rest of the medieval period, for the next 300 or so years, technically, England is a vassal state of Rome, of the papacy.
I didn't know that.
And no one talks about it. About it. And everyone just ignores it, but it's never undone.
Thanks to John.
And the reason, of course, and the reason that this is both stupid and a masterstroke is, he's given away his kingdom. He's been laying plans to take back everything that he'd lost, and he's just given it all away to the Pope. I mean, the Pope loves this because this is Innocent III's great plan. This is what he wants to happen. If every kingdom in Europe did this would be the realization of his dream. So John is doing exactly what the Pope wants him to do. And the reason it's a masterstroke is that immediately takes the sting out of any idea that he can be deposed. He's now the Pope's favourite king. Mm-hmm. Overnight, he's gone from being an international pariah to being the fated favourite monarch of the Pope in Rome. And Philip Augustus now is planning an invasion of England, which belongs to the Pope. Well, what does that make Philip? You can't do that anymore, can you?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, Philip can't invade England. So John has managed to save himself from that, or at least he thinks he has. So it's kind of a masterstroke, but only sideways. So it's also quite stupid.
Yeah.
But John manages to go kind of on the offensive after this, and he ends up, he uses all of that money. He puts into action this master plan to take back the lands in France that he's lost. He goes and lands in Gascony, so around Aquitaine in the southwest of France. And his idea is that he will attack from the south, and he's built this coalition that will attack from the north, which includes his nephew, Otto IV, who is Holy Roman Emperor by this point. And theoretically, on paper, this looks like a really, really good plan from John. He might actually be getting something right. But he's kind of outdone by Philip, who manages to engage those allies in the north at the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214. And this is a really, really significant medieval battle that, again, rarely gets the attention that it deserves, because it effectively saves France from becoming a conquered state of England, because there's every reason to believe that John would have succeeded if he'd managed to get as far as he wanted to. But Philip manages to defeat this alliance, defeat the forces at the Battle of Bouvines, as a result of which Otto IV is so disgraced that he's kicked off the throne as Holy Roman Emperor. So thanks, Uncle John. Thanks for that.
Oh, thanks,
Great.
buddy.
What a guy. Another thing that John's done. And, this becomes another huge loss, huge international embarrassment. John has spent loads and loads of money organising all of this, and it's fallen flat on its face. So when he gets back home, this is where we move into 1215, and he's faced with all of these barons who are absolutely fed up of everything that this man is doing. Everything is failing. Everything is bad. There are no redeeming features to this man. And so early in 1215, they meet with John, and the barons turned up armed and very clearly ready for a fight and in pretty uncompromising mood. They demand from John a Charter of Liberties, which is something that Henry I had given at his coronation, which essentially promises to behave, to recognise the law, to protect the kingdom, to protect the church, and all of these kind of things. And John's answer to this is, no, go away. And what he does instead is he takes the cross and says he's going to go off on crusade. I don't believe for 1 second that John meant to go off on crusade, but if he could get any higher in the Pope's estimation, he's just done it. Because now he's a crusader.
Yeah.
And he's just playing all of these cards, all of these Uno reverse cards on the barons, thinking he's clever, thinking he's winning, and all he's really doing is alienating more and more and more people. And so it's 15th of June, 1215 is that famous date. We get that meeting at Runnymede at which the barons force him to put his seal on Magna Carta to recognise that the king is beneath the law, that the law affects the king as much as it affects everybody else, and to place some restrictions on his power. John's response is to seal that charter, and as soon as everyone's gone, he runs and tells the Pope on them. He runs telling tales to Mom. He writes to the Pope and says, look what they've made me do. This isn't fair. Can you fix it for me? And in August 1215, so 2 months after Magna Carta, the Pope issues a papal bull saying that John has been forced to sign something that is illegal, unjust, harmful to the royal rights, and shameful to the English people. Because Rome owns England. So restricting John's power is restricting the Pope's power in England.
Yeah.
And the Pope's saying you can't do that. So John, again, is probably thinking, what a clever person am I? I've got them at every turn. I'm one step ahead of them.
Yeah.
And that's fine until you trip over your own cleverness. So in May 1216, we then get a position where Prince Louis of France, so this is Louis the Lion. This is the man who is married to Blanche, who is John's niece, so the daughter of his sister Eleanor. Louis the Lion invades England, and Philip II kind of says he doesn't know anything about this. I'm definitely not backing this invasion of England because that would be naughty. The Pope owns England. You can't possibly do that. But here, Louis, here's some soldiers and some ships, and off you go. So he's sort of quietly sponsoring what's going on whilst in public saying that he's not doing it. Louis has incredible success, joins with some of the northern barons in England who are disaffected by John's behaviour and particularly his immediate repudiation of Magna Carta. And, they end up controlling most of the southeast of England and the north of England. John is restricted more and more to small parts of land in the West Country. He begins to tear around the kingdom, trying to put out all of these fires. And in October 1216, 5 months into this invasion, we get the moment where he crosses the Wash in the east of England, moving his army around, where he's caught by the tide, loses his baggage train, and according to some sources, loses all of the crown jewels. So the crown that has sat on every king's head since Edward the Confessor, John loses that in the sea because he can't even cross a river properly, or an estuary properly. And 6 days after that, on the 18th of October, 1216, John dies at Newark Castle, probably of dysentery. Although it's a measure of how bad John was considered to be that there is a story that a monk admitted to poisoning John with a toad. Now, even monks are willing to say, yeah, I killed that guy.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Because that would make me wonderful.
Dying of dysentery is what he deserved, too.
Well, for a shit to die of the shits, I mean, it fits, doesn't it?
Man, I was really hoping for some redeeming qualities, but I am more solidified into the party that does not like John. No wonder why he's called, what is it, Bad King John?
Yeah. And there's a reason, nobody really wants to call their heir to the throne, John. I think Edward I maybe has an older son called John, who might have been John II, but we've never had John II. And we know John planned to be buried at Beaulieu Abbey, which is a place that he'd founded, but that was in the hands of his enemies by this point. So that's the reason he's buried at Worcester Cathedral today. You can go and visit his tomb there. He was originally buried between the shrines of St Wulfstan and St Oswald, who were two of his favourite saints. And his effigy that's on top of that tomb is believed to be a good likeness for John. It's the oldest effigy of a king of England that's in England. So we do have the effigy of Henry II in France, but this is the oldest effigy of a king of England that's in England. And I mean, he gives us also one of my favourite quotes of the medieval period, which is from Matthew Paris, who was a monk who is writing later on in the reign of his son Henry III. I mean, he also dies when his son Henry is 9 years old, so doesn't give his son too much of a chance either. But Matthew Paris, writing later on, famously writes of John when he gets to the point in his chronicle where John dies. He writes, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John." I mean, that is such a quote. This guy makes hell worse.
My gosh, can you imagine?
What a way to be remembered.
What a way. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I feel like maybe that should be the title of this episode. But I don't want to
make hell worse.
Yeah, but I don't want to discount the part where we talked about the sisters who were way better.
Yeah.
I am glad that we started with them and that we finished with John, because he deserves to be the tail end of the story.
Yeah, he's definitely the backside of everything, really, isn't he?
He really is. Oh my gosh, Matthew, thank you. I say this every time. I just love the way that you tell history. And I've learned so much today. I feel like I have so many things to do work-wise, but I want to go down this rabbit hole now and start looking into some of these things that you discussed today. And I hope other people do too. I think that's the biggest thing, is that I always hope from these episodes that it opens up some interest in the listeners to do their own research and do their own digging. And
yeah, I hope so. There's just so many fascinating stories out there. If one of these has grabbed you, go and read a bit more about it. Read Kath Hanley's book, Lioness Heart. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And I'm sure, too, you've talked about stuff like this on Gone Medieval as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so Kath's been on Gone Medieval. Kath Hanley's a good friend. I like Kath a lot. I like listening to her. I like her history. I like the way she writes. So she's been on the podcast several times, and she came on to talk about Lioness Heart. We've got lots of episodes about Eleanor of Aquitaine. We've got really good episodes about Richard I. And yeah, we've got a couple of episodes about King John in there as well, and Magna Carta and the impact that Magna Carta's had on history. So
yeah, so definitely go give those a listen. I'll put a link in the show notes to Gone Medieval too, because if you love medieval history, or if you are just learning about it and want to learn more, that's going to be the place to go. You guys are the experts over there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And of course, as always, Matt has also written several books. I'll put links in the show notes for that. And you have a Substack, and I think you posted something recently.
I do, yeah. So I had been neglecting my Substack for a while, so I'm trying to get back to doing that. So the last post that I did was something about Shakespeare's Richard III and what Shakespeare might have meant his audience to understand from his Richard III, which is just me, spitballing about what Richard III's reputation has been treated like for centuries.
You know what? I get it. And I know, my fascination with Thomas Seymour, but it's once you look at when these stories began and who said them, it kind of opens your eyes a little bit more to where the truth lies, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me again. I can't wait to have you back.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tutorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.